The cold was a living thing. It had teeth that bit into the flesh of her knees and claws that scraped her knuckles raw. Alara felt it seep through the threadbare wool of her tunic, a parasite stealing what little warmth she possessed. She scrubbed the flagstones at the Blackwood Pack's great hall, the icy water in the wooden bucket turning her hands a mottled red and blue. Each push of the brush sent a fresh wave of agony up her arms, a familiar pain that had become the rhythm of her life. They called her Omega Scum, filth, ghost blood, a worthless mouth to feed, kept around only because the Pack Alpha, a man of performative cruelties, found her suffering amusing. She was an orphan, the last of a bloodline disgraced and shattered. Her parents had been executed for treason against the Pack, a crime she never understood, their bodies left for the carrion birds in the depths of the ghostwood. She was left behind, a living monument to their shame. She kept her head down, her world reduced to the grimy floor in front of her. The scent of stale ale, unwashed bodies, and the pine smoke from the central hearth filled her nostrils. It was the smell of her cage. She didn't dare look up at the laughing, feasting wolves around her. To be seen was to invite pain. To be invisible was to survive. A heavy boot slammed down just inches from her hand, splashing dirty water onto a finely crafted leather boot. Alara froze, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. "Watch where you're splashing your filth, Omega," a voice sneered. Jorik. Broad, arrogant, and second in command of the Pack's enforcers. He had once tried to corner her in the stables, his hands like vices, his breath hot with entitlement. She had fought back, earning a split lip and a week of no rations for her trouble. He had never forgiven her for the rejection. She didn't speak. Speaking was a privilege she rarely used and often paid for. She simply dipped her head lower, a silent apology, and tried to move her bucket away. But another figure stepped into her view, slender and draped in fine furs, Lyra, the Alpha's daughter. Her beauty was as sharp and cold as a shard of winter ice. "Still scrubbing, little mouse?" she asked, her voice a silken purr that promised only pain. "You missed a spot." Lyra's foot shot out, not with force, but with calculated precision. The heavy wooden bucket tipped, and a tidal wave of freezing, dirty water cascaded over Alara's legs, soaking her thin trousers and pooling around her. The shock of the cold was so intense it stole her breath. It felt like being stabbed by 1,000 tiny needles. A chorus of cruel laughter erupted around the hall. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, her entire body trembling violently. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on her, trying to grind her into the stone. "Clumsy thing," Lyra tisked, feigning sympathy. "Now you'll have to do it all over again. And do it right this time, or you'll be sleeping with the hounds." Again. Alara clenched her jaw so hard she felt her teeth might crack. A hot, defiant spark flickered in the frozen cavern of her chest. It was a tiny thing, a stubborn ember that refused to be extinguished by years of abuse. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. She pushed herself up on shaking arms, her muscles screaming in protest. She ignored the jeers and the pointing fingers. She ignored the cold that was already sinking deep into her bones. She grabbed the empty bucket, her gaze fixed on the floor, and began the slow, agonizing journey back to the well to refill it. Each step was a testament to her refusal to break. They could hurt her body. They could steal her dignity. But that tiny, glowing ember inside her, that was hers, and she would not let it die. The blizzard did not arrive. It attacked. One moment, the sky was a sheet of bruised purple twilight. The next, it was a churning vortex of white. The wind howled like a great beast, a monster of ice and fury tearing at the very foundations of the longhouse. Snow, hard and sharp as flung gravel, hammered against the wooden shutters. Inside, the pack huddled closer to the fire, their earlier bravado melting away in the face of the storm's primal power. But for Alara, the storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing in the hall. Alpha Valerius, Lyra's father, rose from his throne-like chair by the hearth. He was a mountain of a man, his face a mask of brutal authority. His gaze swept the room and, as it always did, it landed on Alara with a predatory gleam. "The hearth fire dwindles," he announced, his voice a low rumble that cut through the wind's shriek. "The sacred kindling from the heartwood oak is required to appease the winter spirits." A nervous silence fell over the hall. The heartwood oak was deep within the ghostwood, a place forbidden and feared even in the best of weather. In a storm like this, it was a death sentence. Lyra smiled, a slow, cruel curve of her lips. "Alara can go," she suggested, her voice sweet as poison. "Her blood is already tainted by that forest. The spirits will know her. She is small and quick. It is a task suited for an Omega." The pack members murmured their agreement. It was perfect. A cruel task, a convenient disposal. Jorik smirked, folding his thick arms across his chest. Alara's blood ran cold, colder than the water on her skin. This was it. This was how they would finally be rid of her. "It is decided," Valerius boomed, a final, unarguable decree. He tossed a small, empty leather satchel at her feet. "Do not return without it." The unspoken words hung in the air. Do not return at all. No one offered her a cloak. No one gave her a handful of bread for the journey. They simply opened the heavy main door a crack, just enough for her to slip through, and then slammed it shut behind her. The sound of the heavy bar falling into place was the sound of her own tomb being sealed. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs and driving ice into her eyes. She was blind in a world of roaring white. Every direction was the same. But she knew the way to the ghostwood. It was burned into her memory, a map of sorrow she could trace in her sleep. She pushed forward, leaning into the gale, her thin tunic offering no protection. The cold was no longer just a sensation. It was an entity, a predator hunting her. It sank its fangs into her, draining her strength, slowing her movements. Her thoughts grew sluggish, her hope a flickering candle flame in a hurricane. She stumbled on, driven by that stubborn, stupid ember of defiance. She would not die just because they wished it. She would not give them the easy satisfaction. Hours bled into an eternity of white and wind. She found the edge of the ghostwood, the skeletal trees clawing at the sky. The snow was deeper here, a treacherous blanket hiding roots and rocks. She fell constantly, pulling herself up with limbs that no longer felt like her own. She was numb, a walking ghost in a forest of them. She didn't know how long she had been walking when the ground simply vanished beneath her feet. There was a sickening lurch, a moment of weightlessness, and then she was tumbling down, down into darkness. Snow and loose rocks scraped at her, tearing at her clothes and skin. She landed with a jarring thud in a deep drift at the bottom of a ravine, the impact knocking the last of the air from her body. For a long moment she lay there, buried in snow, the world a muffled roar above her. This is it, she thought, a strange sense of calm washing over her. This is the end. It was almost a relief. The cold would take her, and the pain would finally stop. But then, through the wind's howl, she heard another sound, a low, pained groan. It was close. It was the sound of a creature in its death throes. Curiosity, or perhaps that last flicker of life force, compelled her to move. She pushed herself out of the snowdrift, her body a symphony of agony. A few feet away, sheltered by a rocky overhang that was almost a cave, was a shape. A massive, dark shape against the white snow. It was a wolf. But it was larger than any wolf she had ever seen, bigger even than the largest alpha in his shifted form. Its fur was the color of a starless midnight sky, and its body was racked with shudders. A dark, ugly gash ran along its flank, crusted with frozen blood. A shard of obsidian-like rock was embedded deep in the wound. Dark magic. It pulsed with a faint, sickening energy. Fear coiled in her gut. This was a predator, a monster of the deep woods. She should run. She should hide. But as she looked at the shallow rise and fall of its chest, at the pain in its labored breaths, she felt something else. A strange, inexplicable pull. A resonance. It was not pity. It was something deeper, something ancient and unnamed. This magnificent creature was dying, and she, who had nothing, who was nothing, could not bear to watch it happen. Slowly, cautiously, she crept closer. The wolf's head lifted weakly, and a pair of eyes, glowing with a faint, dying silver light, fixed on her. There was no aggression in them, only pain and a profound, soul-deep weariness. She reached the wolf's side, her own shivering forgotten. Without thinking, she shrugged off her tattered tunic, the only barrier between her and the biting wind, and draped it over the creature's massive form. It was a pathetic offering, but it was all she had. Her bare skin screamed in protest against the cold. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. She knelt beside the great wolf, her hand hovering over the ugly wound. She had to get that shard out. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she reached out. Her trembling fingers, numb and clumsy with cold, brushed against the hot, matted fur near the wound. The world exploded. It was not a sound, but a feeling. A cataclysm of heat and light and raw power erupted from the point of contact. A searing, white-hot agony shot up her arm, as if she had plunged it into a forge. She screamed, a thin, tearing sound lost in the storm. A symbol blazed into existence on the back of her hand, etched in lines of pure silver fire. A perfect crescent moon, cradling a single, brilliant star. The light from it was blinding, illuminating the small cave with the intensity of a midday sun. The dark magic emanating from the obsidian shard hissed and evaporated like water on a hot stone. The great wolf arched its back with a tremendous roar, a sound that was no longer weak, but filled with earth-shattering power. The light intensified, and the creature's form began to shift and warp. Bones cracked and reformed, limbs elongated, fur receded into skin. Alara scrambled backward, her heart trying to batter its way out of her chest. Where the wolf had been, a man now knelt, rising to his full, staggering height. He was immense, a giant forged from shadow and moonlight. His shoulders were broader than any two men she knew, his body a landscape of corded muscle and ancient scars. His hair was a wild mane of black silk, dusted with snow. He turned his head, and his eyes found hers. They were no longer silver. They were molten gold, blazing with a terrifying, possessive fire. The sheer force of his presence was a physical blow, pressing the air from her lungs. He was power incarnate. He was the storm given form. He took a step toward her, his movements fluid and predatory. The pain in her hand was a roaring fire, but it was nothing compared to the terror that seized her. This was a god, a monster. She was nothing. He stopped before her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He looked down at her, his golden gaze sweeping over her shivering, half-naked form, lingering on the glowing, freshly burned mark on her hand. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, a sound of profound satisfaction, of an ancient hunger finally sated. His voice, when he spoke, was deeper than thunder, a gravelly rumble that vibrated through the very rock beneath her feet. Mine. The word was not a question. It was a statement of absolute, undeniable fact. It wrapped around her a claim, a brand on her very soul. He reached out, his large hand moving with impossible gentleness, and his fingers brushed her cheek. The contact sent another jolt through her, not of pain this time, but of warmth, of a shocking, terrifying rightness. "You're her," he breathed, his golden eyes wide with 1,000 years of searching, of loneliness, of waiting. "I have found you." Alara could not speak. She could not move. Her mind, so used to abuse and fear, could not process this. Her body, however, betrayed her. It leaned into his touch, craving the impossible warmth he offered. Her instincts, long buried under layers of pain and self-loathing, screamed a single, terrifying word: mate. What was happening to her? Who was this man? This impossible, beautiful, terrifying creature who looked at her as if she were the sunrise after an eternal night. Her entire reality had been shattered, and in its place was only him, and the burning, possessive fire in his golden eyes. She was falling, and she didn't know if he was her savior or her doom. Kaelin, for he had whispered his name to her in the shelter of the cave, a name that felt like a secret and a promise, moved with the certainty of a king. He had stripped off his own heavy fur-lined cloak and wrapped it around her shivering body. The scent of pine, winter storms, and something uniquely him, something wild and powerful, enveloped her. It should have been terrifying, but instead, it felt like the first truly safe place she had ever known. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. Alara let out a small, involuntary gasp, her hands flying to his broad shoulders to steady herself. The muscle there was like granite. She was acutely aware of every point of contact, of the heat of his body seeping through the layers of cloth, chasing away the bone-deep chill that had been her constant companion. "Hold on," he commanded softly, his golden eyes scanning the top of the ravine. The blizzard was already beginning to subside, its unnatural fury fading as his own strength returned. The dark magic that had fueled it had been an anchor, a poison meant for him, but her touch had burned it away. He moved with a speed and grace that defied his size, scaling the steep, snow-covered incline of the ravine as if it were a set of stairs. When they reached the top, the ghostwood looked different. The oppressive, malevolent aura she had always felt here was muted, held at bay by his mere presence. The trees seemed to bow as they passed. Alara was lost in a daze of confusion and fear, warring with a strange and overwhelming sense of belonging. Her hand throbbed, the silver mark a constant burning reminder of the impossible event in the cave. This man, Kaelin, claimed her. He called her his. No one had ever wanted her for anything but a servant or a target. To be wanted like this, with such fierce, unwavering certainty, was more frightening than any beating. She felt a question bubble up inside her, a desperate need to understand. What are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. He didn't stop walking, his long strides eating up the distance. "I am the Alpha King," he said simply, as if stating the sky was blue. "And you, little moon, are my queen." The words made no sense. Alpha King? Queen? She was Alara, the Omega scum, the worthless orphan. Her mind reeled. This had to be a dream, a hallucination brought on by the cold. Soon she would wake up, frozen to death at the bottom of the ravine. But the strength of the arms around her, the steady beat of his heart against her ear, the burning mark on her hand, they were all too real. As they cleared the edge of the ghost wood, movement caught her eye. 2 figures, half hidden behind a snow-laden pine. Alara recognized them instantly. Lyra and Jorik. Their faces were masks of shock and disbelief, their eyes wide as they stared at her, held in the arms of the magnificent, terrifying stranger. Then, their gazes dropped to her hand, which was resting against Kaylin's dark tunic. The faint, silvery glow of the new mark was unmistakable, even from a distance. A claiming mark. Lyra's shock curdled into a mask of pure, venomous hatred. Jorik's expression was one of calculating greed. They had been sent to confirm her death, and instead they had found this. Kaylin's head snapped in their direction, a low, dangerous growl rumbling in his chest. He had scented them. Lyra and Jorik flinched as if struck, their pack wolf instinct screaming at them in the presence of a superior, overwhelming power. They stumbled backward, turned, and fled, disappearing into the woods like frightened rabbits. "Friends of yours?" Kaylin asked, his voice laced with deadly calm. "No," Alara whispered, a new kind of fear, a cold, familiar dread, creeping into her heart. "No one is my friend." She had seen the look on their faces. They wouldn't just report this to Alpha Valerius. The glowing mark, the powerful stranger. This was bigger than pack politics. This was something dark and dangerous. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that they would not let this go. They had seen her as worthless, a thing to be discarded. Now, they saw her as something else. A prize, a weapon, a key. And that was infinitely more dangerous. Lyra and Jorik didn't run back to the Blackwood Longhouse. They skirted their own territory, moving with a frantic urgency toward the jagged, shadowy peaks of the Emberfang Mountains. Jorik knew the paths, the secret ways. He had made clandestine journeys before, trading pack information for silver and influence. "Did you see him?" Lyra panted, struggling to keep up. "The power coming off him, it was like nothing I've ever felt." "And the mark," Jorik grunted, his eyes gleaming. "The star-cradled moon. The old legends, they spoke of it. The Alpha King's fated mate. The one who would unlock his full power." Lyra's face twisted in a snarl of jealousy so potent it was almost beautiful in its ugliness. "Her? That little Omega rat? How is that possible? She is nothing." "She is not nothing anymore," Jorik corrected, a cruel smile touching his lips. "She is the king's weakness, and Lord Morven pays very well for the weaknesses of his enemies." They reached a hidden cave, its entrance marked with a crude carving of a serpent eating the sun. Inside, a man in dark robes waited by a small, smokeless fire. He was an acolyte of the Ember Covenant, a shadowy organization dedicated to the overthrow of the Alpha King. Lyra and Jorik spilled their story, their words tumbling over each other in their eagerness. The acolyte listened, his face impassive, but his eyes burned with a fanatical light. When they were finished, he simply nodded. "Lord Morven will be pleased," the acolyte said, his voice a dry rasp. "He has searched for the girl of the prophecy for decades. To think she was hiding as filth in a backwater pack." He looked at Lyra and Jorik, a flicker of contempt in his eyes. "You will be rewarded. Now go. Your part in this is done." They were dismissed like the tools they were, but they didn't care. They had set in motion something vast and terrible, and they would be rich for it. As they scurried away, the acolyte produced a small, dark crystal and whispered into it, his words carrying the news that would ignite a war. The key had been found. Kaelin moved with purpose, carrying Alara toward the rising sun. He was taking her to his own lands, a place called Silverwood Vale. He spoke of it as a sanctuary, a home. The word felt foreign on Alara's tongue. But as they traveled, a tremor ran through the land, a deep groaning of the earth. Kaelin stopped, setting her gently on her feet. His head was cocked, his golden eyes narrowed. "The storm's source," he murmured. "It was a binding ritual. My presence here has weakened it, but the poison still seeps into the earth. It is corrupting the ley lines. I must sever it, or this entire region will wither and die." He pointed toward a small, abandoned hunter's cabin, nestled in a copse of birch trees. "Wait for me there. Bar the door. I will be back before the moon is high. I promise." He looked at her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. He cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. "Do not be afraid. Nothing will harm you." Alara wanted to protest, to cling to him. The thought of being alone again, even for a few hours, sent a spike of panic through her. But looking at the grim determination on his face, she knew this was something he had to do. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. He gave her one last lingering look, a look that promised retribution on anything that dared to touch her. And then he was gone, melting into the trees with supernatural speed. She made her way to the cabin, her body aching. The fur cloak was a comforting weight, but without his immediate presence, the world felt sharp and hostile again. She entered the small, dusty cabin and slid the heavy iron bar across the door. It offered little comfort. Hours passed. The sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent. Alara paced the small space, the bond thrumming beneath her skin, a constant connection to him. She could feel him, a distant presence of immense power, battling something dark and ancient. Then, the bond screamed. It wasn't a sound, but a psychic shriek of agony and rage, his rage. The cabin door splintered, exploding inward off its hinges. Men in black leather armor, their faces hidden by featureless iron helms, poured into the room. They moved with silent, deadly efficiency. Followers of the Ember Covenant. Alara scrambled back, a cry catching in her throat. She looked for an escape, but they were everywhere. One of them lunged, and she reacted on pure instinct, a surge of desperate energy flowing through her. A faint shimmer of light pulsed from her, pushing him back a step. It wasn't much, but it was something. Their leader, a tall man with eyes like chips of obsidian, sneered. "A little spark. How quaint." He snapped his fingers. Two of his men came forward, brandishing thick chains made of a dull gray metal. Silver. The moment the chains touched her, the world dissolved into pure, unadulterated agony. The silver burned her skin, but that was nothing compared to what it did to the bond. It felt like a blade, hacking and sawing at the very essence of her soul, trying to sever the connection to Kaelin. She collapsed, screaming, the pain beyond anything she had ever imagined. Through the white-hot haze of her suffering, she could feel Kaelin's frantic, distant roar of fury and terror. He knew. He knew she had been taken. The men dragged her from the cabin, her vision graying at the edges. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the leader picking up a single strand of black hair from the floor. Kaylin's hair, and sealing it in a small lead box. They had what they came for. She woke to the damp chill of a dungeon. Rough stone walls slick with moisture surrounded her, the only light coming from a single torch flickering outside her cell. The silver chains were still wrapped around her wrists and ankles, bolted to the wall. Each link was a source of constant, gnawing pain, a poison that leached her strength and kept the bond a muted, agonizing ache. The separation was a physical wound. It was a hollow, gaping void in her chest where he was supposed to be. She could feel his frantic searching, his world-shaking rage, but it was distant, distorted, like a shout heard from underwater. She was alone, truly alone again, and the despair was a crushing weight. A heavy door creaked open, and a figure entered her cell. He was tall and unnaturally gaunt, dressed in robes of black and crimson. His face was sharp and aristocratic, but his eyes held a chilling emptiness, like twin black holes that consumed all light. This was Lord Morven, the Shadow King. "So," he said, his voice a soft, cultured whisper that slid over her skin like a serpent. "This is the great treasure, the Alpha King's destiny. You are underwhelming." He circled her, his cold gaze dissecting her. For centuries, Kaylin has ruled, a beacon of so-called light and order. But his power, for all its strength, has always been incomplete. The prophecies spoke of his mate, a catalyst who would unlock his full potential, a living heart for his kingdom. Morven knelt before her, his face inches from hers. His breath was cold, smelling of dust and decay. "He sees you as his salvation. I see you as a key. A very specific key, designed to fit a very specific lock." He gestured around the dungeon. "This fortress is built upon a confluence of dark ley lines. The silver of your chains is not merely silver. It is infused with the essence of a fallen star, a substance that inverts and corrupts soul magic. With you as the focus and a piece of him as the anchor," he tapped a lead box at his belt, "I will not just sever your bond. I will reverse it. I will use it as a conduit to drain him of all his power, his life, and pour it into myself." He smiled, a bloodless, terrifying thing. "He will die, feeling his soul being devoured because of you. His great love will be the weapon that unmakes him, and you, little Omega, will be the fulcrum upon which the world changes." The casual cruelty of his plan, the way he spoke of her as a mere object, a tool, shattered the last of her composure. She was not a fulcrum. She was not a key. She was Alara. And this man was going to murder the only person who had ever looked at her and seen someone of worth. Rage, hot and pure, burned through the despair. It was a foreign feeling, but it was powerful. "He will find you," she hissed, her voice trembling but defiant. "He will tear you apart." Morven laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Let him come. He is already weakening. Can you not feel it? The bond you share is already turning to poison in his veins. By the time he arrives, he will be walking to his own execution." He rose and left her in the suffocating darkness, the echo of his laughter slithering in the air. Despair threatened to swallow her whole. He was right. She could feel the bond fraying, Kaylin's distant presence growing fainter, tinged with a sickness that was not his own. Morven was killing him through her. She closed her eyes, shutting out the grim reality of the dungeon. She couldn't give up. She wouldn't be the weapon that killed him. She focused past the burning of the silver, past the crushing despair, and reached for that thin, damaged thread that still connected them. She poured all of her will, all of her fledgling power, all of her desperate, terrified heart into that connection. Kaylin. She didn't speak the name. She was the name. She screamed it into the void between them. For a moment, there was nothing but silence and pain. Then, a flicker. A spark of gold in the darkness of her mind. A voice, raw with agony and iron resolve, answered her. It was not in her ears, but in her soul. Hold on, Alara. The connection was weak, strained, but it was there. It was real. I feel you. Hold on. I am coming. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of fierce, desperate hope. He was coming. The Alpha King was coming for his queen, and she would hold on. The ritual began at dusk. Alara was dragged from her cell and chained to a great black altar in the center of a cavernous chamber. Runes carved into the floor pulsed with a malevolent crimson light. Lord Morven stood before her, flanked by his inner circle of robed acolytes. He held the lead box containing Kaylin's hair in one hand and a cruel-looking ritual dagger in the other. The bond is a bridge, Morven intoned, his voice echoing in the vast space. And tonight, we shall walk across it to claim what is ours. He began to chant in a guttural, ancient tongue. The runes on the floor blazed brighter. The silver chains around Alara's wrists grew searingly hot, and she cried out as the bond was stretched to its breaking point. She felt a pulling sensation, a violent siphoning, as if her very life force was being drawn out of her and twisted into a weapon. She could feel Kaylin, his power being leached away, his life dimming like a dying star. He was close, so close. But he was too weak. Just as blackness began to swarm at the edges of her vision, the entire fortress shook with a cataclysmic impact. The far wall of the chamber didn't just break, it detonated, exploding inward in a shower of rock and dust. Framed in the breach, silhouetted against the blood-red sunset, was Kaylin. He was no longer the calm, controlled king. He was a force of nature, an avatar of pure, unrestrained fury. His golden eyes were blazing infernos, and his power rolled off him in palpable waves, a suffocating pressure that made the very air crackle. Behind him stood his Silver Legion, an elite guard of warriors whose eyes glowed with pale silver light. Morven! Kaylin's roar was the sound of an avalanche, of a breaking world. You will pay for touching what is mine! The battle was instant and absolute. The Silver Legion crashed into the Ember Covenant acolytes, a storm of flashing claws and steel. Kaylin moved like a blur, a shadow of death cutting a path directly toward the altar. He was magnificent. He was terrifying. And he was bleeding. A deep gash wept blood from his side, a wound sustained breaking through the fortress's dark wards, a wound that wasn't healing properly because of the draining ritual. Morven laughed, a high, unhinged sound. You are too late, King. The ritual is already complete enough. She has made you weak. Morven abandoned the chant and met Kaylin's charge, wielding a blade of pure shadow. The two leaders clashed in a dizzying display of power, their blows shaking the foundations of the mountain. Kaylin was stronger, faster, but the draining effect of the bond was taking its toll. He staggered, his movements becoming a fraction slower. Morven saw his opening. He feinted high and then thrust his shadow blade low, burying it deep in Kaelin's already wounded side. Kaelin roared in pain, falling to one knee. His golden eyes, full of agony, met Alara's across the chamber. He had failed. He had come for her, and he was going to die for her. Seeing him fall, seeing the man who had called her his queen, the man who had wrapped her in his own cloak and looked at her with reverence, brought to his knees, something inside Alara did not break. It ignited. The tiny ember of defiance she had nurtured for years, the spark of power she'd felt in the cabin, the fierce, protective love that had bloomed in her heart for this ancient, lonely king. It all coalesced and erupted. It was not a sound. It was a dawn. A wave of pure, brilliant white light exploded from her. A supernova of life and healing and raw, untamed power. The silver chains on her wrists didn't just break. They sublimated, turning from solid metal to harmless vapor. The crimson runes on the floor were scoured away, replaced by the pure, clean stone beneath. Morven's acolytes were thrown back, their dark magic dissolving in the face of her incandescent purity. The light was not a weapon of destruction. It was a declaration of life. It washed over the chamber, and where it touched the Silver Legion, their wounds closed, their fatigue vanished. It poured into Kaelin, a torrent of warmth and strength. His wound steamed and sealed in an instant, the shadow magic within it annihilated. His golden eyes, which had begun to dim, blazed back to their full, furious glory. Alara stood, no longer chained to the altar. The light emanated from her, her tattered servant's clothes seeming to whiten, her form radiating a soft, silver luminescence. Her eyes, once filled with fear, now glowed with the calm, steady light of a full moon. She was not the Omega scum. She was not a tool. Morven stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. Impossible! You are nothing! A worthless stray! She met his gaze, and for the first time in her life, she felt no fear. Only a vast, unshakable certainty. She raised her hand, the mark of the star-cradled moon blazing with power. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It rang with the clarity of a silver bell, filled with an authority that silenced the battlefield. I was never nothing, she declared. I am Alara. I am the mate of the Alpha King. Her glowing eyes shifted to Kaelin, who was now rising to his feet, staring at her with utter awe. And you will not harm my mate. She thrust her hand forward. It was not a blast of force, but a concentrated beam of pure, undiluted life. It struck Morven not as a blow, but as a judgment. It didn't burn him. It unraveled him. The dark magic that held his ancient body together, the shadows he commanded, they were simply erased by the light. He screamed, a thin, pathetic sound, as his power dissolved, leaving him a frail, withered husk. He collapsed to the ground, his threat extinguished, his darkness undone. Vulnerable, broken. Kaelin was at his side in a heartbeat, his claws extending. He delivered the final, swift justice, and then the battle was over. Silence fell over the chamber, broken only by the panting of the warriors. And in the center of it all, Alara stood, the silver light around her slowly fading, leaving her standing in the sudden quiet, her heart pounding with the aftermath of a power she never knew she possessed. The fighting was done. The silence that descended upon the chamber was profound, broken only by the sound of Kaelin striding toward her. He moved past the bodies of his enemies and the kneeling forms of his own warriors without a glance. His entire world had narrowed to her. He stopped just before her, his massive frame radiating a heat that was both power and relief. His golden eyes, no longer burning with rage, were now wide with an emotion she had never seen directed at herself. A mixture of awe, reverence, and a love so deep it felt as ancient as the mountain around them. Alara. He breathed her name, and it was a prayer. The last of her borrowed strength left her, and her knees buckled. He caught her instantly, sweeping her up into his arms, holding her against his chest as if she were the most precious thing in the universe. She buried her face in the curve of his neck, inhaling his scent, reassuring herself that he was real, that he was alive. He held her tight, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other pressed firmly against her back. "You saved me," he murmured into her hair. "Your light. It was like the birth of a star." She looked up at him, her own eyes filled with tears. "You came for me." It was a statement of wonder. No one had ever come for her. "Always," he vowed, his voice thick with emotion. He lowered his head and his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of desperate passion, but of profound, soul-deep connection. It was a seal, a promise. It was the end of loneliness and the beginning of everything. In that single touch, she felt all his centuries of waiting, and he felt all her years of pain, and they washed each other clean. When he pulled back, he gently took her right hand, the one bearing the claiming mark. The star-cradled moon was no longer a burning brand of pain, but a calm, intricate pattern of silver light woven into her skin. "The bond," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "It is stronger than I ever dreamed." A new certainty filled her, a quiet strength born from the cataclysm in the chamber. She was not just a passive recipient of this bond. She was a part of it, an equal part. She reached up with her marked hand and pressed it flat against his chest, directly over his heart. She closed her eyes, not focusing on the brilliant, explosive power she had unleashed before, but on the steady, warm love she felt for him. She pushed that feeling, that choice, that acceptance into the bond. "Mine," she thought, echoing his first word to her. But this time it was not a claim of possession, but a declaration of partnership. "You are mine, as I am yours." A gasp escaped Kaylin's lips. A brilliant light flared from beneath her palm. When she pulled her hand away, a new mark was emblazoned on his skin, glowing with a golden light that matched his eyes. It was a mirror image of her own, a sun, radiating light, cradling the same single brilliant star. The bond was complete, forged not by fate alone, but by her choice. His mark had been a claim, hers was an acceptance. Now, they were truly one. They returned to Silverwood Vale not as a king and his rescued servant, but as a matched pair. His city was a marvel of white stone and living wood, nestled in a valley so green and vibrant it hurt the eyes. As they walked through the gates, the people came out to see them. They did not gawk or whisper. They bowed their heads in respect, their faces filled with awe, not for him, but for her. News of her power, of the light that had saved their king, had traveled faster than they had. He led her through the cheering crowds, up the steps of a beautiful palace, and into a throne room that was open to the sky. His entire court was assembled, the most powerful alphas and elders from 100 allied packs. They all knelt as one when Kaylin entered. He led her to the dais, where a single, massive throne of silver-veined weirwood sat. He stood before his people, his arm wrapped securely around her waist, a gesture of both possession and support. "My people!" his voice boomed, filled with a joy and pride that resonated through the hall. For centuries I have led you alone. The prophecies spoke of a mate, a queen who would be the heart of our kingdom. I have found her." He turned to her, his gaze soft. "This is Alara. She is not just my mate." He looked back out at the assembled crowd, his voice rising with power and conviction. "She is the light that banished the shadow. She is the fire that reforged your king. She is your queen." He gestured to the throne beside his own, a second, more elegant one that had not been there a moment before, grown from the living wood of the dais at his silent command. He was not placing her beside him. He was making a space for her that had always been hers. He led her to it, and she sat. The wood felt warm and alive beneath her. She looked out at the sea of faces, her people. She looked at the man standing beside her, his golden eyes filled with a love that promised forever. The cold, shivering Omega who scrubbed floors was gone, washed away by fire and light. The worthless, invisible orphan had died in a dungeon. In her place sat a queen, a woman of immense power, a woman who was loved, a woman who had finally, after a lifetime of suffering, found her home. And it was not the throne, or the power, or the kingdom. It was the warm, steady presence of the man beside her, and the completed bond that beat in time with her own heart. She was home.